I would agree with the words of the Shorter Catechism, Westminster, which asks, what is the chief end of man? And the answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And so I would say that is why we are made in God's image. To be able, part of it is to be able to have a relationship with him, to glorify him. And the thing about that is it's not just why we are created, but there's a beauty in it. And the reason is because God is the most desirable. He is the most beautiful. He is the most excellent. He is the most wonderful. And so our enjoyment in him comes out of simply really knowing him. And so that's where you have guys like John Piper talk about a Christian hedonism. And the idea is that because God is so beautiful, maximally beautiful, that when we know him, we, fulfilling the reason why we were created, are actually experiencing joy. And Jesus says things like this when he says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come that you may have life and life abundantly. And Jesus describes himself as the resurrection and the life. So when I understand a complete Christian worldview, I see that our highest, most beautiful, not just duty, but also delight, is to know our Creator. And fortunately, Jesus has made that possible through the cross. And so that's where I land. And, you know, this is part of my own testimony in that when I was sort of in those high school days, I was raised in a Christian home, but I was nominal. But as I read through the book of Ecclesiastes, I saw a hopelessness that I identified with, that I felt that was most certainly the case if there was no God. That was the most certainly the case. And that Ecclesiastes really is pivotal in my own life, because as I read the words, I realized if this is true, then the only thing worth doing is knowing him that let me get on with it. And it helped me really have a seriousness. Let me read some of the words that have affected me from Ecclesiastes. This is from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. And I would say that is the state of mankind if there is no God. And I think some of the existentialist philosophers, even though they engage in a project of self-delusion, such as Sartre or perhaps Nietzsche, would actually agree with that. They just take it in a different direction.
All right. Well, if that's a good stopping point, that's about the right time. Patrick, you have 3 minutes.
Okay. So my main contention is that the problem of meaning, especially of some kind of ultimate meaning or the meaning of life, is a difficult problem, and that unfortunately God can't make it any easier. I think we all have a sense of the things we can look to find meaning in life. Things like helping others, or exercising our creativity, or meeting our goals, those kinds of things. And it sounds to some extent like VOCAB agrees with that when he says that the meaning that God can provide us has to do with God's perfection and with an aesthetic appreciation of that, which to me indicates that there are other kinds of aesthetic virtues that can provide meaning, but they're simply inferior to Christianity's source of meaning. I don't think there's much that you can promise someone who doesn't already believe in God to get them to see that. And I also think that you can't really assign a purpose. I'm not sure in what way an outside entity could make something meaningful to someone else. I'm not sure that it makes sense to conceive of meanings that are not inherently subjective. And I think that the question of the meaning of life is essentially malformed. If I had to assert a position on the meaning of life, if not the meaning of ordinary things or sort of proximate intermediary meanings, it would be the view that Thomas Nagel expresses in his paper on the absurd. And he says that there's it's not really a matter of our finitude or our smallness or our mortality, or injustice in the world. But the fact that we have the ability to take different perspectives and to notice.
Hey, Patrick, we're going to let you pick that thought up on the other side of the break. We got to come to a break, but we'll give you about a minute and a half on the other side to finish your thoughts.
Pick up right where you left off, if you would.
Sure. So my final thought on the question of meaning is sort of a positive position. And I'd say that I take the position that Thomas Nagel expresses in his paper, The Absurd. He talks about how most of the things that we point to as sources of absurdity or reasons to say that life is or would be meaningless are inadequate for various reasons. I don't have time to get into them right now. But he says what it does come from is the human ability to take different perspectives and the clash of intuitions we feel when we notice a difference between something's actuality and its pretension. So he uses an example of a notorious criminal is made the president of some philanthropic group. That strikes us as absurd. And so the idea is that life itself seems absurd to us because not only do we have this conflict of perspectives, because we have our daily strivings that seem important to us on the one hand, and then we also have the ability to sort of step back from our daily strivings and to see ourselves, he says, as an ant struggling up a heap of sand. And there's something absurd about that because there's something deep and meaningful that we're pretending to be that we don't seem to be. And the struggle with the absurd is that we can't resolve that the way we resolve absurdity in other cases. We can't simply remove ourselves from the situation or call for the president of this philanthropic organization to stand down or to step down. We can't avoid the perspective-taking problem in our lives the same way we can avoid those.
Okay, VOCAB, why don't you, sorry for cutting you off there, Patrick, but you can pick that up. VOCAB, why don't you go ahead and respond?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to paint the picture, it's hard in such a short time, to show how there's no version of atheism, there's no really worldview outside of triune Christianity that can offer objective meaning and value. So when we understand, if we believe that everything comes into existence at a big bang, which is not really planned on atheism by anyone or anything, they may even say it's inevitable, but they still have to understand that it's ultimately sort of the universe being fortuitous. It's serendipitous that it happened. That is what it is. But those same sort of factors, these sort of natural things that are occurring, will result in our ultimate wiping out. Whether it's collision with something, whether it's heat death, there's these scenarios, and they may be further away that would really wipe out life on Earth and, it seems, the human race. Now, if that's the case on atheism, in what way does any event have any ultimate meaning? It's wiped away. It's only, and anything a person does is only important relative to events, but if anything they do changes the fate of, quote, history, but the history is just wiped out, it had no purpose or design in the first place, then how does any one action actually matter in a grand scope of things, in an objective way? So folks like Jean-Paul Sartre has an essay I encourage people to read, Existentialism and Humanism. And in there, he really talks about how this is true, but therefore we assign our own meaning and therefore give it meaning. I would say this is an exercise in self-delusion, and every atheist has to do this when they see, yes, it is absurd, yes, it ultimately stops, but I can sort of just import or pump into the system value for my life, meaning for my life, make it seem more grandiose than it is, but they should realize that they're doing so against their own worldview.
Patrick.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to address is the idea that because everything that exists now will eventually be destroyed, or every moment that exists now will sort of become irrelevant in history, I'd like to address that. And the problem with it is that it's essentially begging the question. So if we say that what I do now won't matter because in a billion years all of life will be erased, we are asserting that it won't matter in a billion years, which I don't know if we can establish, because if it doesn't matter, I guess so so on the flip side, if what happens in a billion years doesn't matter now, just as much as what happens now doesn't matter in a billion years. And to assert that it doesn't matter in a billion years, then, is to assert that it doesn't matter at all. If we derive meaning from something, it can't be tied to a specific point in time. The second thing is I'd just like to ask VOCAB what he means by objective meaning, because I'm not sure I can properly understand the term. And that's all.
Okay. VOCAB.
So objective meaning, and I'm going to use common parlance, is meaning that actually matters. Or maybe you could say it's transcendent, that it has meaning outside of the subject. And I would say if it's not rooted in something that's eternal, then it's by definition temporal, therefore temporary, meaning it can't really be ultimate in any real sense. It can be sort of virtually ultimate or virtually objective in the person's mind, but it's not tied to anything that matters. And therefore, there can be no transcendent meaning or value or purpose, or I would even say dignity for humans on atheism. And not only that, but there's the lack of rootedness in it. But there's all, well, I think I got 1 minute left. Do I got 1 minute?
Yeah, one minute, yeah.
But there's also the issue of there's no standard by which to measure it by. Meaning, one person can say, this is the reason why I do what I do. Another person can say, here's what I think my ultimate purpose or value is. But on any atheistic worldview, they're ultimately equal. So instituting death camps all throughout Europe, you can't make any kind of judgment that that is better or worse than someone who says, I'll spend my life living in leper colonies, helping them and giving them solace. I don't see how we can even say one is better than the other. So the objective aspect has to do with the fact that it's not rooted in anything that has any kind of permanence.
All right, yeah, you have a little over a minute before our break, and then we'll give you the chance to come back. Patrick, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm still not sure I can get anything out of your articulation of objective meaning. It sounds kind of like it feels to me like you've cooked up this concept and atheism can't support it, but I see no reason why we should try to support it. As for the kinds of moral questions you were just asking, I think the question of meaning might be separate from the question of morality. There are things that we can do that are meaningful, like personal development. We'll say that, it's meaningful to refine your ability to think critically or refine your physical capabilities, your body. And those aren't necessarily inherently moral acts. And the last point, which I guess I probably won't have time to get into in the next few seconds, is that just because something is not derived from God doesn't mean that there's no possible kind of comparative standard between different moral acts, although I think that is a separate question from the question.
We'll give you time on the other side of the break to continue that thought and use the rest of your time. Patrick?
Give you another minute or so to explain your position.
Yeah. So I'd like to diverge slightly. I don't really have time to articulate a secular position, a secular meta-ethics right now. But what I can do is point out, as has probably been done to death, since ancient Greece, that it's really, really difficult. There's a serious problem when you try to derive a kind of morality from God. So there's the question, the infamous question, does God command it because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? There's something sort of deeply unsatisfactory about the idea that something is good merely because God commands it, especially because God could change his mind about what's moral and what's not. There's this idea that if it was up to God, one day murder could be abominable and the next day it could be perfect, fine. Or that something totally morally inconsequential, like rubbing your nose, could become morally egregious if it's good merely because God commands it. Then the question is, if God commands it because it's good, then there's some sort of external framework separate from God that determines whether or not something is good. And maybe God has special access to that, and he conveys it to us somehow. But in that case, it's still not a morality derived from God himself. And so I'm not sure it's even possible to talk about a morality which is sort of just handed down to you from God.
Okay, vocab.
Yeah, when we discuss this, it's good to look at people that have thought about this and just to see, okay, do they have a point here? So, for example, Dr. Rue in 1991 made an address about this predicament, really, the modern man finds himself in after having sort of cast off the shackles of religion and all this. At least that's sort of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment era thinking. He talks about that we really fool ourselves into thinking that we and what we do and the universe itself has value with something that he actually calls a noble lie. And really what Patrick has, I think, advocated is sort of that self-fulfillment is sort of individually determined. I don't know how we could have any communal or agreement upon it. Sir, we could have large swaths of agreement about what is meaningful or purposeful or why you're created or not here and there, but you could have someone say, well, I believe this ethnic group is created for this purpose, this ethnic group's created for this purpose, or this nation is, well, not created, but exists for this purpose, and we determine it. It can change. But listen to his words, actually, what he says, Dr. Rue, quote, "There is no final objective reading on the word or the self. There is no universal vocabulary for integrating cosmology and morality." And he talks about how to avoid the madhouse option. And he ends with saying, without such lies, we cannot live. The lies really that Sartre was also, I would say, encouraging people. And you know, there's sort of a miserableness to all of this that if it's honestly thought about and the foundations are looked at, the choices are not very glamorous. But I want to make sure that people don't hear me as saying, come to Christianity, come to Jesus, because he'll make you happy, and atheism won't. It's not merely a pragmatic argument, although it is practical. I believe showing atheism is not practical. The point is, this is our very duty and delight for why we were made, and we will find no rest until we find our rest in him.
Well, Patrick, we split you again a minute now, and then we'll give you the rest of your time when we come back. Go ahead.
Sure. So I'm not really sure what the bit about, like, enumerating, different races or ethnicities and saying what their purpose is would be at all relevant to an atheist, because, if there's no creator, such purposes can't be handed down. I think the idea that man has a purpose is kind of offensive, really. But, we can have better than subjective standards of morality. We can have, if you can accept the basic belief that suffering is bad and pleasure is good, you can come up with a standard that doesn't depend on. You can do some work to quantify these things. And to come up with a system of morality that ultimately isn't about what someone thinks at the end of the day, about how they feel the problem should be. There are arguments where one person has to concede to another that something is a morally superior option. And the more troubling thing is that Christianity doesn't save people from these disputes. Is that
hey, Patrick, let's let you finish that on the other side of the break. Give you about a minute and a half in our last segment. Thank you, and we'll see you on the other side of the break, everybody, along with Patrick.
Why don't you continue on from where you had left off?
So short of supernatural intervention to get people to agree with one another, there's no mechanism in Christianity by which people come to agreements about moral disputes. And we can tell this because Christians have deeply, deeply disagreed with one another about what's right and wrong forever. I see no advantage conveyed in terms of building a consensus or comparing moral beliefs to one another conveyed by Christianity. I mean, the Bible, and I'm sure it's not quite the same thing as the slavery, the slaves we brought out of Africa, right? It's more like an indentured servitude type of thing. But the Bible does explicitly condone slavery. And we later decided that we moved past that. And the Bible was cited on both sides of that argument. And I don't see how you can argue with a straight face that Christianity really binds the moral community together in a more powerful way than any other kind of secular metaethics, than a sense of duty or respecting others' freedoms or a sense of trying not to hurt others. I don't see how there's anything more universal in Christianity. That's all.
Well, at this point, then, there's an open dialogue that I guess will be primarily, Patrick, between you and VOCAB. Maybe just to get it going, you had said, Patrick, I think something like the thought that man has a purpose is kind of offensive. Did I get that quote?
Yeah.
Could you expound on that a little bit?
So it seems a little bit presumptuous to assume that there has to be some kind of ultimate purpose, and to render humankind into some kind of tool for a rather mysterious and unclear end. And to say, and looking at the specific issues, especially the way it was cast when he was quoting, I forget whom said that this race was made for that purpose, that race was made for that purpose. It seems really short-sighted to say that someone's possible legitimate functions in life are limited by something like race or any other feature of creation, which race incidentally isn't, right, because it's not really rooted in biology. But yeah, so I think the idea you can tell someone this is what you're for, you are for doing this, is offensive.
So Patrick, what I was saying there is that if an individual can kind of determine their purpose, they can say, here is why I want to live, here's why I want to carry on, or anything like that. And most people we know don't explicitly say it, but let's say, I'm involved in some ways with geek culture. There's plenty of people there who their goal is to become the highest level on some role-playing game, or their goal really is to own a certain amount and a certain condition of comic books of a certain type. I mean, that is really sort of the next chase they're onto, and then they're on to the next one until they die. And people have different versions of that. What I'm saying is that it seems like you're okay with people individually doing that. Well, I guess some of my questions are, why can't someone else do that for other people too? Like, for example, saying, here's why you exist, and say, let's say the group of people or the person disagrees, and they can make their will happen. And that's where I would say Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and he's saying, look, it's true, we've killed God, so there ain't really nothing, so what do we got left? The will to power. Here's the way to sort of achieve that. And so that's a little more what I was getting at. What I'm saying is, why could someone say it's wrong to say any one purpose a person says is their purpose? Why would they say, well, that's the wrong purpose for you? And then also, why are people not allowed to say, here's your purpose too? Why does it have to stop with ourself?
Okay. So I'm not totally sure about purpose, but with meaning at least. So the idea is that if meaning is inherently subjective, that the thing that meaning depends upon is the subject. It's reflexive. It's sort of trapped in its own container in that way. And so for that reason, it doesn't make sense for someone else to be able to tell you what something means to you, because they are not the subject. So if you reject the idea of an objective purpose or of objective meaning, there can be no assignment of meaning. There can be no assignment of purpose. So as for the cases of people who choose to do things that are pretty unaspiring, and whether or not that can constitute a meaningful life or part of a meaningful life, there are what they call hybrid views, which say that meaning is still ultimately subjective. It's something that a subject has. It's a property of a subject. But that it relates to certain objective features out in the world. And so one of them might be a sense of interconnectedness, some kind of social purpose. Or one feature might be creativity or moral development. Or morally righteous acts, or virtuous ways of being. And so you say that the meaning is subjective in that it's contained in the subject, but it can only be attained when the subject is exposed to or interacts with certain types of objects. And so, like, an example like, if you took the same case, like, that guy wants to get to a certain level on an MMORPG, and that's clearly not meaningful. You could say, well, that's because it lacks any kind of creativity or moral righteousness or empathy or these other, you could try to enumerate them, but that would probably be foolish. Other properties of outside objects that then relate to the subject and convey meaning. And
Patrick,
so I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm almost done. I wouldn't keep going, but I'm right almost done. So, like, if what he was doing in the game instead, for example, was organizing a large group whose job it was to make it easier for new players to be welcomed into the community. So he sort of made a guild of greeters to the game or something. Or if he was playing the game as part of one of those like gaming for charity efforts or something like that. You could say the act is essentially similar, but there are meaningful properties that you didn't see in the first case. And the meaningful properties are social or moral or aesthetic or creative.
Using that example, you could also conceive of an example where in one of those in an RPG, massive online game, someone might see they get most joy out of making things difficult for players to join, right? So in contrast,
there are a lot of those, yeah.
All right, and so in that equation, and again, sort of going off what you said, if sort of meaning is in its own container, then we have no right to essentially say someone who gets their meaning out of making it difficult for people to enter a game is necessarily better or worse.
Or more or less meaningful.
Yeah, exactly, more or less meaningful than someone who makes it easier for players to get in a game, correct?
Well, the question would be: Can we find some moral property or aesthetic property or creative property relevant to the acts of the ganker, as they're called, right?
So, Patrick, would you say
and
that
I think
meaning?
Struggle to.
Would you say that meaning is directly? It sounds like you're saying meaning is connected to morality.
It can be. I'm not sure that morality is the only possible source of meaning. In fact, I don't think that it is.
Because some of the examples you gave seem to indicate that. That's because you were saying, well, this one is. I mean, you said, for example, the guy who just kind of goes around on his own, or the guy that makes it difficult. You said the guy who's organizing, that is more meaningful, and some of the things you gave seem to indicate sort of more moral. But it does seem that meaning and morality are connected. But even just on that, are you actually saying that the guy whose meaning in a particular game is to make it more difficult for others, that's less meaningful than the person who is organizing? Is that what you're saying? I mean, could you?
I'm saying
I want a
probably,
straightforward one.
I'm saying probably, but not necessarily.
But Patrick, what kind of guide is that for meaning and purpose?
It isn't, and I think that I think there's something sort of naive and greedy about demanding an ultimate purpose. I think it's a weird idea that we can have a meaning that does not relate, that doesn't mean something to someone.
Let's say
that isn't dependent upon a subject.
What if I find my purpose in being naive and greedy? Do you think I cannot have that as my purpose?
That's meaningful to you, but it's not upright. So there are separate questions there as well. So it doesn't mean that I approve of that behavior, but it may very well be meaningful to you. You may just be deluded.
The very use of the word upright indicates some kind of barometer or comparison or plumb line, if you will. And so I'm having a lot of trouble understanding why you're saying it's not upright. That means you're comparing it to something. And I also don't understand why you would say your meaning has to be upright or it should be. So you understand why that doesn't sound right coming from an atheist to me, right? I mean, you understand why that'd be confusing.
I do, but I don't. So I think that this only really presents a problem if you assume from the beginning that there can be no objective or absolute or intersubjective morality among atheists. And we haven't talked that much about morality in detail because the main subject here was meaning and purpose.
Right.
And so, I don't make value judgments about meanings. When I say that something seems like a less meaningful behavior, it's sort of a statement about whether I think it means something to that person. But when I endorse or reject actions in a moral sense, I'm not making the same kind of evaluation. And I personally am not ready to fully endorse a particular meta-ethical position.
Okay.
I'm a tentative Kantian when it comes to meta-ethics. But I don't think that positions like simple ethical naturalism, like saying that suffering is bad and pleasure and comfort are good, and things that cause more suffering are worse than things that cause less suffering. I don't think that's a difficult or arbitrary or weak position to take.
So, Patrick, would you agree with this statement? He's an atheist, Nobel Prize winner, a physicist, Steven Weinberg, and he writes this in his book, The First 3 Minutes. He says towards the end, quote, "The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy," end quote. Do you agree with Weinberg's quote there?
Just a second. If he's saying that life is absurd or that it seems absurd or feels absurd, yes, right. So I think what he's talking about is he's taking on that big picture perspective in which our daily struggles seem minute and unimportant. When you study cosmology, you may see yourself as an ant struggling to climb a pile of sand. But ultimately, that's a discomfort about the two different ways that we can and have to view our lives. We do this reflexively. We can't just not think about our individual sort of down on planet Earth perspective. We can't choose to neglect that, and we can't choose to neglect the bigger picture either, and that leads to discomfort for us. And I think that's the real source of the sense of the absurd.
But I think we can choose to ignore that, and that's where the issue of sort of distraction and not wanting to think about it and just being merely entertained, amusement, can come in. And I think that could be a valid purpose or meaning just as the one who's thinking about it. I just don't see how one is more meaningful or more valuable. We have about 40 seconds left, Patrick. If you want to use it, you can.
Yeah, so I'm not, when I'm talking about something being more meaningful, I'm not necessarily talking about something being more valuable. Something that's more meaningful is more valuable to the person that it means something to. Ethical values, I view, if not in an objective way,
10 seconds.
A defined way, a definite way.
Well, thank you for joining us. Maybe we can do this again, Patrick. I appreciate it. Important topic. Wish we had more time.